Good morning and a very warm welcome to the second day of the IIASA anniversary event, Systems Analysis for Reducing Footprints and Enhancing Resilience. I would like to extend these greetings in particular to all our online participants who join our event from all over the world. Thanks for being with us virtually here in Vienna. My name is Viktor Bruckmann and I'm the IIASA National Member Organization Secretary for Austria and based here at the Austrian Academy of Sciences. Together with Elena Rovenskaya from IIASA, I had the great pleasure and honor to develop the program for today as Executive Program Co-Chair. This would not have been possible, however, with the great help of many helping hands which you were partly in touch with during the registration and yesterday's event. In particular, I would like to highlight the support of Gensen Pillay, Sergei Sitsov, Jerry Edwards and Julia Schaubach from IIASA, as well as Christian Köberl, Chair of the IIASA Committee at the Academy, and Johannes Bernhard Lindner, who is behind all the technical setup of this two-day event. Thank you for your outstanding efforts during the last months. Let me now briefly highlight some of the key messages from yesterday's opening event and blend this with some of my own observations. In the keynote presentation delivered by Albert van Jaarsveld and the subsequent panel discussion, we learned that there are numerous global science efforts in place to provide the best possible advice to achieve the sustainable development goals. And we urgently need these initiatives because we have entered a phase of reacting to consecutive crises. Therefore, we need mitigation and adaptation strategies, and in other words, reducing our Anthropocene footprints and enhance resilience of systems that are vital for us. A systematic to-do list on the pathway to equality, sustainability and well-being was set up by the United Nations in 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals that are mentioned. 7 years later, we have to admit, unfortunately, that we are still struggling to deliver on the SDGs. And this is also because of their complex nature. Some goals can be addressed simultaneously and generate co-benefits, where others may be even in competition with each other. Systems analysis is therefore critical to understand complex interactions across multiple objectives. But also, just to give you an example, even more so to understand, for instance, the concept of justice and equality as such. It needs new initiatives to fast-track these SDG objectives, and this was clearly highlighted yesterday. Collaboration across borders, the founding spirit of IIASA, the DNA of IIASA, is one of the key elements that builds on to achieve a truly transformative science. We need a global network of sustainability centers that builds on transdisciplinary co-production of solutions, and that was one of the ways suggested yesterday. Needless to say is that this all needs long-term funding, and funding needs political commitment, and as such, the support of citizens. Therefore, communication has to be increased from raising awareness as a minimum to a collective understanding to really integration in participatory approaches in the best case. People are heavily influenced by their existing beliefs, often based on ideology and religion, when they evaluate any particular scientific finding and results. Most people are just not waiting for scientists to tell them what to think. Hence, the solution is not simply providing them with more figures and facts. Systems analysis can contribute towards reducing footprints and enhancing resilience in multiple ways, and we will hear a lot about this and many examples in today's session. Elena will be kindly introducing you to these further sessions today, later on. Ladies and gentlemen, before I hand over to Elena, I would like to do some housekeeping, providing you with some essential information for today. There are 3 points. Number 1, there's a slight change in the program. The second plenary starts 15 minutes earlier. Therefore, please reconvene in the Festsaal at 5:15 p.m. instead of 5:30 p.m. for the second plenary. Second point, as you are probably aware, the conference format is a fully hybrid format. All sessions will be live streamed and recorded. For on-site participants, that means please, whenever you interact with the session moderators, with the discussions, use a microphone. Otherwise, the online participants won't be able to follow the discussions. We have assistants with mobile microphones around for that reason. Participants joining us via remote web stream have also the ability and possibility to interact via the text chat box underneath the live stream window. These questions will be directed directly to the moderator, who will further handle them. And the third point, the poster session. As you are aware, we have a poster session downstairs in the aula. All posters, also those from virtual presenters, are printed and available. They are marked so you have the ability to see which presenters are actually on site and which contributions are online. And therefore we have 4 different ways of interaction. If you're an on-site participant and would like to engage with an on-site poster, that's clear, that's the standard practice. You approach the poster presenters during the poster session, that's the lunch break. You can also view the posters during the coffee break. If you're an on-site participant and you would like to engage with a virtual poster presenter, you can do so in 2 different ways. You will find QR codes attached to each poster. You can use your mobile device, scan this code, and that will direct you to IIASA Connect, where you may post comments and questions. But you have to register at IIASA Connect. In case that doesn't work, or you don't want to register, we have set up 2 terminals downstairs, which you can use to interact with the poster presenters as well. Online participants can also interact with on-site and online poster presenters. Online participants with online poster presenters works via IIASA Connect with registration, and poster presenters on virtual posters are asked to monitor the incoming questions during the poster session. If you are an online participant and you would like to interact with an on-site presenter, that works as well via IIASA Connect, but please keep in mind that the answer may be taking some time, and therefore the poster session will be open after this event as well. That's rather complex, so in case there are still questions, please do not hesitate to get in touch with me or one of the conference assistants. I wish now to introduce you and to hand over the microphone to the Executive Program Co-Chair Elena Rowenskaya, who will further introduce you to today's program as mentioned before. I wish you an exciting day full of interesting presentations and discussions, and to IIASA, happy birthday and the best wishes for the next 50 years and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Victor, for this excellent introduction. And let me just join you in welcoming all our participants, both those that are with us here today in person, as well as those that are now online and following us by means of the internet. So it's great to have you all here, and thank you for joining us, and I hope that we will meet your expectations and provide you an exciting program. To give a hint at that, allow me to introduce our parallel sessions Obviously, because they are parallel sessions, we cannot be in all of these sessions at the same time, and that's why we thought that it would be good to have from our side a little bit of an introduction so that you could orient yourself and choose which sessions you want to attend. And of course, as Victor said, video recordings will be available later on, and those sessions that you will not be able to attend, you can always watch later. The conference has a heading, Systems Analysis for Reducing Footprint and Enhancing Resilience, and this is at the same time the heading of the new IIASA strategy that we adopted last year, and the strategy will then guide our research for the next 10 years. So these two pillars, reducing footprint and enhancing resilience, are two major topics that we try to reflect in those 5 parallel sessions of the conference program today. Therefore, it's not surprising that one parallel session that starts at 11:30, each parallel session, by the way, lasts for 2 hours. So one parallel session in the morning has a title, Achieving Resilience in a Complex World, Guidance for Action from System Science. And this session was convened by Brian Fass, our colleague from IIASA. So in this session, we will hear from a diverse set of system scientists. Actually, there are 8 speakers in this session, which will provide short interventions focusing on the question how system thinking can motivate transformations that address the global socio-ecological crisis. And in particular, we should look at actions of institutions as well as individuals that could implement that in a holistic manner. So those of you who are interested in this topic, please join this parallel session at 11:30 in the morning today. So parallel to this, also at 11:30, we will have a parallel session that focuses on how can we more realistically reduce footprints by focusing our research and management on nexus problems, and in particular on water, energy, food, land, ecosystem nexus. So these 5 systems are obviously very closely interrelated, and in order to realistically reduce footprints, we have to actually consider them all together and consider all the relevant interlinkages between the systems. And the session will be discussing that. The session was co-convened by our IIASA colleagues Tahir Kahil and Amanda Palazzo. And those of you who are interested in the nexus management issues, please join that session. And of course, systems analysis would not be possible without appropriate data. And data is really a key question for systems analysis. And therefore, the 3rd session in that block, which starts at 11:30 in the morning, focuses on new data for understanding complex systems. This session was co-convened by IIASA colleagues Stefan Fritz and Linda See, and will focus on new data sources that can help to provide additional insights into the questions of resilience and footprints. So in particular, it will focus on data sources such as Earth observation, citizen science. These are the topics where IIASA has a very strong standing and long tradition of research, as well as novel mobility data, mobile phone data, and even data from medical field that can be collected and used for systems analysis. So if you're interested in the topic of data and data science, please join that session. In the afternoon, we will have 2 more parallel sessions, and those sessions will be focusing on how can we make systems analysis more realistic and more applied to the real life. And we approach this challenge, this key challenge, from 2 sides. One parallel session is titled New Frontiers in Systems Analysis, Theories, Methods and Tools. And from the title, you can already see that it will be focusing on the methodological aspect of systems analysis. This session is co-convened by Fabian Wagner, our colleague from IIASA, and myself. We note here that for policy analysis and for policy support to become more useful and more used, we actually need, at this point in time, we actually need methods and techniques that make relevant humans and institutions as integral part of the research. So not having them as external to our research, but really integrating humans and institutions in our analysis. So how can we actually do it? What are the methods for doing that? Will be considered considered in this session. And we will review actually a very broad variety of methods that are attempting to achieve this goal, from game theoretical approaches, which bring more realistic assumptions about agent behavior, to studies of behavior using big data from social media, to diverse examples of participatory research combining modeling and stakeholder interactions. So join us in this session if you are interested in the methodological dimension of systems analysis. Last but definitely not least, another session which will be in the afternoon starting at 3 o'clock is called Integrating Science with Policy and Society, Lessons from Applied Systems Analysis. Co-convened by IIASA colleagues Thomas Schinko and Barbara Willards. This session will reflect on how science-policy-society interface has evolved since IIASA early days up to now, and identify enablers and barriers for impactful transdisciplinary research in the 21st century. Transdisciplinary research goes beyond integrating stakeholders as research subjects and seeks to foster really a discourse, often termed knowledge co-production, co-creation, all these core terms that are relevant here, and really towards creating transformative science. So join our colleagues in this session if you are interested in these topics. As you can see, all these sessions, all 5 sessions, try to go beyond the current state of the art, trying to review where are the new frontiers in systems analysis, ultimately attempting to address that how-to question that was raised yesterday in Albert's talk. So as one of our colleagues said on another occasion, we actually not only have to consider the how-to question, but how to do how. And this is really what we are trying to do, how to really, with our research, with steering it in the direction of providing more realistic and more adequate advice, how can we really facilitate transformation to sustainability and overcome all the barriers that Albert was telling us about yesterday. So this was a short overview and the logic of how we created the program. I hope that gives you enough guidance to make decisions which sessions to visit, to attend. And as I said, others will be available anyways. Before I finish my little contribution here, so I also want to join Victor in his thanks to the organizers and to the technical support. So without them, this event would not have happened, obviously, and there was a lot of work that was done on the background that usually the participants don't see, but when everything runs smoothly, you can be sure that there was a big team working towards that. So I will not list these people again. Victor kindly did this already, but yeah, we are really, really thankful to the people who supported this event from different sides. And finally, before we proceed to our plenary session, we would like to demonstrate you a very short video. So we are grateful to Austria as a host country. IIASA is very grateful to Austria for hosting us for 50 years. And we would like to give you a very short overview of how IIASA works with Austria in this video that we want to run just now. Thank you for your attention, and let's proceed to the video. Thank you.
Warmly welcome also from my side. I feel extremely honored to be asked to chair the first plenary section today in the morning, and it's a wonderful group, I think, of speakers. It's a very important topic, resilience and sustainability, and let me really also start with a big thanks to Elena and Victor for really setting up a wonderful program. Let me give a big thanks, I think, to IIASA, Albert, and also of course to the Austrian Academy of Sciences, I think, for having the opportunity to have the whole conference here in these wonderful rooms. In terms of the time, I think I will announce a point which Victor already announced, I think, for the afternoon, that we have a 15-minute shorter coffee break, and I guess I would also announce now a 15-minute shorter break for the coffee, just to give enough time for the speakers in this session. Let me first introduce our first speaker, Belinda Reyes. She's a chair in sustainability science at the University of Pretoria in South Africa since 2018. And it's a wonderful career. So before you moved to South Africa 2018 to the chair, you have been already there, but in a different institutions from 2004 to 2015. She has established and was also the chief, in a sense, of the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services Research Group at the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research in South Africa. In 2015, you moved to Sweden to the Resilience and Development Program at the Stockholm Resilience Center before you moved back to South Africa. So a wonderful career. Your main work in terms of the methodology and theories is in combining and bridging the socio-ecological system sciences together with sustainable development practice. And not only that, you are widely published and cited, but it's really important to really sell it not only to research, but also to have a really good kind of like connection to policy. And this is, I think, clearly also showing up by being on the board of many international committees. And let me just highlight one. It's the high-level advisory panel for the UN Special Report on Human Security. So you're really bringing science also out to the public, and we're all looking forward to your talk on resilience for and through sustainable transformation. And there's one rule I should also announce. We decided to have immediately after each talk 5 minutes of discussions. And then if time is left, but I'm afraid not, I think we could have another discussion at the end, but most likely we will move the final discussion then also to the coffee break. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Alexia, and thanks to IIASA and the organizers for inviting me here to join you today. I'm very fortunate to have had a long and fruitful collaboration with IIASA, not quite spanning 50 years, but probably 20 years, and so I count myself as part of the IIASA extended family. So I was asked to talk about these two concepts, resilience and sustainability transformations, in 15 minutes. And so actually what I'm going to do is just give a brief snapshot of where I see these ideas and applications of resilience and the ideas and practices of sustainable development meeting, and the fruitful and generative opportunities, future avenues, and some of the challenges that are occurring in this space. So it's wonderful to be here celebrating 50 years of IIASA. These past 50 years have also been very important years for the human development journey and for the evolution of the concepts of sustainable development. Most of you here in the audience and online know that it is in these last 50 years that we've seen this great acceleration in many of the social and economic measures of development, accompanied by a great acceleration in the rate of impacts, in the growth of the rate of impacts of human activities and choices on the environment. It was also 50 years ago that attention began to be called to the problems and the limitations of the dominant model of development at that time. And in 1972, we see the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment happening in Stockholm, and the resultant attention and declarations that were drawn to the environmental limits and impacts of development. And so we see the beginning of this journey of sustainable development from these early ideas of growth with environmental limits and actually economic growth almost as the solution to environmental problems. And of course, in the last 20 years, we've seen this evolve into a much more integrated, interconnected, and universal approach to sustainable development, recognizing the economic, ecological, and societal pillars of sustainable development. And this has been really mainstreamed by things like the UN Agenda 2030 and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that are keeping us all very busy. But it is to the future that I want to look in this talk and ask what lies ahead for sustainable development. What lies in the future that needs to move beyond this rather static idea of sustainable development as three pillars to be able to account for the world that we're living in today. A world that has been so strongly shaped by human development choices and actions that it now represents a new, hyper-connected, uncertain, and unpredictably dynamic context, very different from the world of 50 years ago. And it is in this world that the concepts and ideas of resilience and sustainability transformations are truly coming to the fore in many areas of research, practice, and policy. I'm not going to bore you with all the statistics of the trends of this new context, the climate change, the biodiversity loss, the emerging disease risks, and the food and energy security challenges. But I do want to pay attention to what I see as some important signals of this context. And these are captured in the latest Human Development Report produced by the UN earlier this year. These are many signals of downward trends in human development recently, including the Human Development Index, which has actually backtracked over the last 2 years to levels last seen in 2015. The same report picks up on rising levels of human insecurity across multiple dimensions, highlighting that this is happening in all countries, but especially an increase in those countries with high human development indices. The report points to this idea of a new uncertainty complex that is emerging, of course acknowledging that we've always lived with some uncertainty, but they point to these new layers and interactions between these layers of destabilizing planetary change, the pursuit of sweeping societal and economic transformations that we're seeing around us, and these levels of widespread and intensifying polarization around. And many other scholars and reports are providing similar signals that the time of risk and uncertainty is right on our doorstep, not only in a decade's time or even in the next century. And we all know that these risks and their impacts land on already an unlevel playing field, as Albert made clear in his talk last night. Not everyone was part of that great acceleration. And so we see these globalizing and rising inequalities both hampering our abilities to respond to risks and exacerbating the risks themselves. And so if the world in which sustainable development is happening is changing, then so too does the concept and the application of sustainable development need to reorient and transform itself to be able to better engage with these problems of uncertainty and dynamic and complex systems. It needs to be able to move across this problem space to be able to engage with the complex and contested problem spaces that we're all finding ourselves in. Resilience, of course, has emerged as a very popular approach and avenue to deal with uncertainty and risk. This is just a slide taken from the Global Resilience Partnership, which represents just the number of partners, the amount of interest, and of course the size of investments going into resilience programs and projects. In fact, since about 2008, these investments in resilience programming have now become very substantial, spanning large regions of the world, many government agencies, many donor groups, philanthropy groups, and of course cutting across multiple sectors from climate change all the way through to gender equality. Resilience, as most of you know, is also not an easily agreed upon term. It has many definitions, many frameworks, and many approaches. And I'm not going to be going into that messy space here in this talk, but rather just to acknowledge that I come from the perspective of a social ecological systems approach to resilience. I'm not saying this is the right approach or the only approach. It's one that I've used and found useful, but I'm hoping that many of these insights that I share with you are relevant no matter what definition or approach to resilience you're finding useful. So social ecological systems resilience has very deep roots in the study of complex adaptive systems. In fact, social ecological systems are a type of complex adaptive system that adopts a humans in nature perspective, really focusing on the interconnectedness and interdependencies of humans and their environment, which I think has quite a lot of relevance to many of the interconnected challenges of sustainable development. From this perspective, resilience is defined as the abilities of individuals, communities, or systems to respond to and navigate change, to be able to continue to live and develop with change. This includes both the abilities to absorb and adapt to change, but also this ability to transform with change, to reconfigure into an entirely new system, which is where this area of sustainability transformations or transformations to sustainability is now focusing. As this is a conference about systems analysis, I thought it might be useful to just briefly pause here and focus on what are some of the core features of social ecological systems as complex adaptive systems, which have been recently and very usefully distilled by a colleague in South Africa, Rika Preiser, into this typology of 6 principles of complex adaptive systems. Basically, she highlights that these social ecological systems have adaptive capacities and can therefore navigate and respond to change. They determine more by relationships than the parts. They're radically opened and influenced very strongly by external factors and cross-scale dynamics. They're shaped by dynamic processes such that system properties and behaviors emerge from patterns of interactions across scales that shape and are shaped by the context. That's the next one, the contextually determined. The fact that they're shaped by dynamic processes means that they're constantly changing and often in nonlinear ways. And the final feature is this idea that systems have novel qualities that emerge through complex causality, which means we need to be able to account for the multiple and multi-scale recursive causal pathways that determine these contexts in which we work. So together with colleagues at the Stockholm Resilience Center, we decided to look at what do these features of social ecological systems and their resilience imply for the research and practice of sustainable development? What are the shifts in the focus and methods needed in sustainable development to be able to account for these core features? And we summarize them into these 6 shifts, which we go into more detail in the paper at the bottom there. But very briefly, I'm just going to describe these shifts and then give some examples of their application. So basically, the first shift is really away from this focus on the productive base of sustainable development, the idea of natural and social and human capital as that base, to rather focus on the dynamic capacities in these systems that shape responses to change. The second shift moves from a focus and a tendency to deconstruct and tear apart systems to understand their component parts, to rather focus on what connects those parts, the relationships. The third shift is really acknowledging that any boundaries that are static and determined are largely artificial, and we need to acknowledge the fluid and porous nature of boundaries and their need for constant review in consultation with people and those affected by the choices of those boundaries. The shift from outcomes to processes acknowledges the need to move away from this focus on short-term targets and outcomes as fixed endpoints, and rather acknowledge the processes of development and how those shape sustainable pathways and how we can maintain or shift those pathways. This is not to say outcomes aren't important, but to go beyond just seeing them as those endpoints, to acknowledge this interplay between outcome and process. The fifth shift is one that has been called for a lot in sustainable development practice, to move away from this reliance on blueprints and generic interventions, to recognize context sensitivity. And here we go beyond this idea of context as idiosyncratic or unique, to rather point to the fact that the patterns and behaviors important to sustainable development are often recognizable and are shaped by the dynamic interactions of that context. And so we move to a focus that rather looks about which interventions may work with which types of contexts to be context sensitive. And finally, the shift from these often hidden assumptions that underlie our work of linear cause-effect relationships of this input led to that output, which led to that outcome, to rather be able to engage with the complexity of cause and effect in order to be able to deal with the novelty and unpredictability of how sustainable development processes emerge. So as many of you are probably asking, are any of these shifts even feasible or practical? And so we went to the literature of how resilience is being used in sustainability transformations or in sustainable development to see if there was any evidence of any of these shifts in the work that was going on. Fortunately for us, after this 10 to 12-year investment in resilience programming, there is now a substantial literature of reports, evaluations, meta-reviews, and systematic reviews, all examining these investments in resilience and how they've worked and what they've meant, and what those practices and approaches look like. And this spans a transdisciplinary literature from reports all the way through to systematic reviews globally, as well as in some small case study areas like this bottom slide in northern Namibia. And looking across all of these documents and programs and projects, we did indeed find evidence that all 6 of these shifts are feasible and practical and actually being made a lot of the times by practitioners in their practice in these projects. So we see a large shift from a focus of capitals to the idea of resilience capacities. In fact, several of the NGO and development agencies work now focusing on resilience as capacities. We see many shifts from a focus on breaking systems apart to a focus on resilience as relational and a focus on actually capturing and mapping those relationships both on family farms here as an example, as well as in conflict-torn areas of Zimbabwe. And we even see some evidence of that very complicated shift, that 6th shift about complex causality, where groups like Mercy Corps are embracing the complexity of cause and effect in their systems and mapping out what they actually call complex resilience causal chains, linking gender norms with resilience in many of the areas that they're working in. So very innovative progress when these shifts are put into action. Of course, there are many challenges and barriers, and I'm not going to go into much detail here, but a lot of this is around what we say versus what we do. We often use the words relationships and capacities, and then use methods that go back to object-oriented or capital-oriented measures. Sadly, across many of these meta-analyses, we see evidence of resilience projects actually increasing vulnerability and eroding resilience. Lots of challenges in the funding and evaluation space, but also these compromises that are made when complex oriented ideas are tried to sort of be rammed into more linear evaluation log frames and practices. And of course, these existing capacities to engage with complex contexts that are constantly marginalized by these dominant approaches. For those of you worried that these challenges are too deep and too big, what we did find in this analysis was that once you make one shift, you bring the other shifts along. The shifts themselves are intertwined. And so it isn't imperative that you implement all 6 shifts at the start of a project. And finally, just to conclude, what we found most exciting is in the projects and programs that we're implementing and making these shifts, we actually saw them resolving many of the long-standing tensions in sustainable development. The tensions we're all familiar with: bottom-up, top-down, social versus environmental, structural versus agency approaches, intervention versus context. We actually found these projects were able to hold these tensions and find a creative and less binary space between these poles. And in many cases, the shifts enabled them to step outside of this line connecting the poles and to find a fruitful perspective in the site outside of those dichotomies. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, I think, for this great overview. Let me start again. Many thanks for this great overview and really kind of like a tour de France through the development also of the meaning of sustainability and how we have to change it. Let me now ask first the audience in the room if there are any comments, questions. Wolfgang?
Well, Wolfgang Lutz from IIASA. Thank you very much for this very inspiring lecture. I'm sort of a bit stuck in my mind with one of these shifts that you mentioned, that is moving from a focus on outcomes to process. But isn't there the danger that we are sort of just moving blindly if we don't have a goal, don't have an aim inside? I mean, in the terminology of Donella Meadows, she distinguished between the ultimate ends and then the intermediate ends. So the SDGs are, to many respects, intermediate ends. But we need to have a vision where's the ultimate end, and that is an outcome. Isn't this the case?
Yes, I agree. I think that this is just about challenging the notion of outcomes as short-term and as the actual end point. And we see this a lot in projects with a 3 to 5 year funding horizon. And I think with the SDGs that many times they're interpreted as the ultimate outcome. I think what we're calling for in this shift is a focus to rather understand the process and to use the outcomes to learn as the process evolves. So it's more about this interaction between outcome and process, and to adaptively manage those outcomes as we realize how the process may be going in a different direction from our original intentions and outcomes.
Many thanks. Does it work or not? Yes. Are there any further comments, remarks? Yes, in the last row, please. If you could give the microphone there.
Yeah, Reinhard Mechler, can you hear me? Yeah. Maybe on this one, very interesting. Thanks for the inspiring talk. We work a bit with Mercy Corps in the Flood Resilience Alliance, and indeed we got this dual nature of outcome and process. And I think it's overlapping. For example, we're working with those communities to build resilience, and one outcome is also communities want equitable access to resources, participation, empowerment. So I think quite often these capacities and capitals tend to be overlapping, and so I find this really interesting, and just as a comment and response to Wolfgang and you, and thanks for your work. Maybe you have another comment on that. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. I think this point about capitals and capacities, we definitely know that capitals matter, but only to the extent in which they create a dynamic capacity to respond to change. And in fact, in most cases, capitals are found to be quite poor proxies of capacities. And so I think that's a real challenge for those of us doing system analysis to think about how one more accurately captures those dynamic capacities. And just to your point about resilience, I think the challenge is when resilience becomes the outcome, one pays less attention to the dynamic processes that are shaping the systems with the emergent properties and unpredictability within them. So we just notice this trade-off between outcome and process and dynamic process.
We have 2 more questions, and I'm afraid these are the last 2 ones. Here in this first row here, and then over there.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much for your presentation. Celion Collon from IIASA. One criticism that is sometimes made to resilience is that it may dwarf the question of justice by shifting responsibility from politics and what created a situation to people and households. So I wonder, in your program and your experience, can you give some comment on this general critiques?
Yes, well, I mean, that point that I made in the challenges about the findings that many of these resilience programs are actually increasing vulnerability and eroding resilience is directly linked to this, because they're treating project sites as closed. So they're only looking at the local patterns and not accounting for these cross-scale and global drivers of that vulnerability in the first place. And this causes a burden shifting that you're alluding to. So many of those reviews point to the need to open up the boundaries and focus on the root causes of that vulnerability, which is impossible if a project is just funded and measured at a site-specific scale.
We have one more question here in the if you can bring the microphone.
Yeah, thanks so much, Michael Kuhn, IIASA. Yeah, this is a great talk and a great framework to think about this relationship, and I'm very much looking forward actually to reading your paper on this, which I haven't done, so apologies. From what I got from your presentation is that you've been looking at a number of sort of projects or approaches and try to see to what extent they kind of are in accordance with a sort of, well, let's call them criteria or properties you've put up there, and you said, well, this and this was actually good, and you found evidence that there's a change in sort of thinking and approaches. I was wondering, I mean, do you have a concrete measure for this? I mean, is could this, or more generally, could this framework be somehow made measurable, or is it just really an issue of looking at it one by one and just see the whole thing because it's so complex and then assess, yes, that seems to be working and that not? I mean, I was just wondering how to actually measure this or make it operational in assessing projects. Thanks.
So we do actually have an enormous spreadsheet of all the projects that we reviewed and all the papers. It's mostly qualitative coding. Of course, you can't be searching for words like relationships or processes because that's the discourse rather than the practice. So parts of it were more a narrative review, but I wouldn't say we made it a measurable as in a numeric scale of you've done the shift 3% or 30%, but I think we were trying to capture, especially in the methods and the results of that work, whether these shifts were evident. And I'd be happy to share that very complicated spreadsheet with you. Great.
I'm afraid we have to move on to the next speaker, but I hope we have enough time in the coffee break to continue. Let me also remind all those who are watching us online, they can also send in the chat questions. I do see them on the iPad and I could read them aloud. So feel free to also ask questions from home or wherever you are at the moment. So let me now introduce the second speaker. I'm happy to announce Flor Alquemede. I hope I pronounced it correctly. Full professor and chair of economics and governance of technological innovation at the Eindhoven University of Technology currently, but before, again, a wonderful career, and let me just mention one. It's the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development of the Utrecht University, where you have been before, and at the Dutch National Center for Mathematics and Computer Science. And it's a great, I think, background you're bringing with you here, and I'm sure we will see some in the talk as well. It's the background in artificial intelligence during your master thesis, and during the PhD, it's basically the agent-based evolutionary economics, something many of us also apply here, I think, sitting here in the room. And the purpose is really, in a sense, to combine simulations which are data-driven. That's exactly what we need, I think. And you really approach it to analyze innovations for sustainability at different scales. And I was fascinated by your recent ESC grant you were awarded. I think it started in 2022. It's called FAST, and the background behind it, it's really to foster the social tipping dynamics to accelerate energy transitions. And it's really the aim, exactly what we heard before. Nothing is linear, nothing is stated. It's really the dynamic interaction and feedbacks we have to bring in our transition models. And I'm sure we will see more in the next 15 minutes. The floor is yours.
So, thank you very much for the nice introduction, and thank you, IIASA, for inviting me to your birthday party. Congratulations. I was asked to highlight some research challenges for system approaches on the topic of innovation, technological change, and society. Well, answering this question, of course, starts by recognizing that new technologies or inventions do not necessarily turn into successful innovations in the sense that they are widely adopted by society, and not all innovations lead to actually desirable changes in society. One could, for example, argue that substituting combustion engine cars by electric vehicles could help to reduce emissions, but it leaves other problematic aspects of our current mobility system untouched. But let me start, let me start by a quote from the President of the European Commission on the Green Deal. And the quote goes, "People are at the core of the European Green Deal. Our vision to make Europe climate neutral by 2050. The transformation ahead of us is unprecedented, and it will only work if it is just and if it works for all." Now, of course, many of our current socio-technical systems, the systems we use to provide our basic needs in energy and mobility, do not have people at their core. In fact, it is only quite recently that utility companies in the Netherlands started to refer to their customers as customers rather than as connections. And interestingly, also the models, the models we use to analyze technological change and innovation, and the models we use to advise policy on how to make these systems more sustainable, also do not have people at their core. And that is what I want to talk a little bit about. Here, a quite well-known example to illustrate why it might be important to bring people a bit more into our models. Now, this graph by Carbon Brief shows the yearly projections of the IEA on the adoption or the worldwide increase of solar power. So year after year, it predicted linear growth, the horizontal blue lines, whereas actual growth showed acceleration, the red line. As an example, so in 2015, the yearly forecast was that there would be an addition of 50 gigawatts a year, but already in 2016 we saw 75 or even a bit more. And for electric vehicles, we see a similar picture. Now, of course, these projections are just that, but they do have real-world impact. So science and technology studies show that expectations like those of the IIASA are performative. This means that if we do not expect growth in these technologies, we will not act upon it, and we will not invest in the needed infrastructures and supporting technologies. Inaccurate models made us hinder the transition to climate neutrality. And an example of this, so in the Netherlands, there's at this moment, it is very or almost impossible to connect new solar parks to the grid due to grid congestion, and many other countries are facing similar problems. Let me go to the next one. Now, one reason why these models might be inaccurate is that some of the main social feedbacks are missing in these models of technological change. They are very much focused on the techno-economics of technological change, and the price of technologies and whether they are below prices of the current technologies. But they miss the influence of social factors like societal acceptance, policy feedbacks, concerns about where these technologies are sourced, of the effect they may have in other countries outside Europe in this case, or concerns about energy security and autonomy. And it is especially important to understand, as Alexia also mentioned, these social factors and how they play out, because they may be the key to realize these social tipping points. So there have been a number of recent papers that argue that changes in the social domain, shifts of norms and techno-economic changes may be an important way to actually accelerate reduction of emissions, whereas other ways are a bit more complicated right now. But to realize these social tipping dynamics, we do not only need to know in what domains these could occur, like changes in norms, like education, like cost-price comparison of new technologies, but we also need to know how these changes arise from the bottom up, and how, if we see pockets of change, we can make it stick. As an example, during the COVID pandemic, we did see several changes in mobility behavior that were actually quite promising. People were quite happy with working a bit more from home, maybe not all the time, maybe also not when the kids were also home from school. But in general, people were quite happy with it, and in surveys were giving back that they would like to have this future way of working where it would be a mix between commuting and working from home. But now, when things have reopened again, we see that in many cases, mobility patterns and also traffic jams are again, and emissions are again back to the levels they were before the pandemic in many places. So it's not only how do you get these changes, but also how do you make them stick, and are there possibilities for policy to adaptively join these social niches or movements to make sure that it does make stick. So that is a big question. and it is very difficult right now to properly investigate that with the models we have at hand. Well, the field of sustainability transitions research has extensively analyzed the role of such social factors and their interactions, but mostly in qualitative case studies, which also makes it a bit difficult to use these insights in models, and in many cases they're of course so location and context specific, making it even more difficult. And this field, the sustainability transitions research, it's very much a systems perspective on sustainability transitions, but it considers people as part of a socio-technical system. So it's a bit different from the socio-ecological perspective. It looks at socio-technical systems, energy systems, mobility systems. And these systems, they include the actors, the networks, the technology, also the governance and institutions. They both constrain the energy and mobility practices of their users. If as an individual I can have the desire to work more from home, but if the current rule in my office is that people have to be there 5 days a week, this will not work. Or if we have this 9 to 5 requirements, it is very difficult to avoid rush hour traffic. So the simple things are also included. These systems constrain what we can do. It's not so easy to change things all by yourself. But at the same time, these systems also offer opportunities for co-benefits and positive feedbacks. And we see that many of these changes in norms and in behaviors, they actually propagate in a bit of a different way than the diffusion of technologies like solar panels, but they diffuse very much to the strong ties in your social network. So the local context matters very much for these new practices that you adopt. And when people experience these co-benefits, like maybe a bit more time at home, maybe health benefits from from being a bit more active in their mobility, that may really help there. But the question on how do these new practices emerge, and particularly how can policy help to make certain behaviors spread and to make them stick more, is still a bit open, and is also still very difficult to treat in models. So how do we approach this in our research? I'll give a few examples from work in my group. So here's an example of, this is a picture of Amsterdam. And the Netherlands has a policy goal to phase out the use of natural gas in the built environment, natural gas for heating, that is. And all municipalities have to make a plan to make this happen. And this is, of course, a huge challenge, because it means that expertise that was previously present at maybe at the level of the utility companies, maybe at the level of some planners, now has to be present in all municipalities, and these capabilities are not so easy to come by. So all these municipalities have made quite a top-down plan of how to go about this heat transition. Here in Amsterdam, the orange part is the city center, the old historical city center. Basically, it means they don't have a plan there. Orange means not a clear plan, just insulate, and then we hope it will all go well. The blue ones are newer neighborhoods, which go for all electric, and the green ones are different types of heat networks. And this decision of how to transition and to what technology is made really on technological grounds. So what technologies are available, and also what is sort of the state of the current housing stock in these neighborhoods. Are they well insulated? Are they old? Are they large? Are they small? Etc. At the same time, we see a lot of bottom-up initiatives. We see a very high demand for heat pumps. So there's now a big waiting list if you want to have a heat pump installed. And Eneco, one of the larger utility companies in the Netherlands, which serves 2 million households, in October announced that they observed, correcting for weather, etc., a 20 to 25 reduction in gas demand by households. They also observed from smart meter data that thermostats were set 1 to 2 degrees lower than in comparable circumstances earlier. So that really signals a behavior change. So we still have to clearly analyze the data, but people from Eneco suggested that this reduction could not only come from people who are affected by the high energy prices, because actually quite a large number of people still have fixed-term contracts and are not so much affected by the prices. So this also seems to be the beginning of a norm shift. And these bottom-up developments are not always compatible with these top-down plans. So that is where it gets interesting, also as a modeling exercise. For example, if you have a high share of heat pumps in a neighborhood, it makes it much more difficult to go to a collective solution like a heat network. And also, if citizens are very concerned about energy prices, there's this persistent belief that heat networks are more expensive because they have these monopoly tendencies. It's not always actually so, but this leads to quite a lot of resistance in some neighborhoods against the heat networks. So there's this tension between these top-down and these bottom-up visions that may actually delay and hinder the transition to sustainability. So what do we do here? We try to make agent-based models of these neighborhoods and of what is actually happening, also together with the people in the neighborhood where they can state what they find important, etc., to see if we can build transition scenarios that actually make use of what's already going on. And hopefully these scenarios will lead to a bit of a faster transition, but one important caveat is, of course, that especially if you look at technological innovations that require investments, that it is very important to also look at energy justice considerations. How do you make sure that indeed all neighborhoods in this case benefit, and not just the neighborhoods that have the knowledge and the resources to invest in these technologies? Now, another example of how we could do this is the NEOM project. It's quite a large project where we want to build new transition scenarios. And we do this by connecting models at different levels of aggregation. So the models that we use in this project also have actors, networks, and technologies. The socio-technical system is in there. We model the neighborhood in a very close agent-based way, but then these models are combined into larger models that investigate the aggregate effect. And things you can investigate here that are quite interesting to do is if we look at energy communities, for example, many of those energy communities, they have goals that are not just about having cheap energy, but they actually create a value that is just generated by being part of the community. So many people that are part of an energy community just like to contribute to the energy community, and that also gives some limits to the scale of these energy communities, because then that community element disappears. Many people in the energy communities, many energy communities actually also put quite a high value on self-consumption. So they like models where they can use as much of their self-produced energy as possible. And that does not necessarily always mean they contribute most to a sustainable overall energy system, because you can think of other scenarios where a little less self-consumption would actually be beneficial. And so they have these values that are not necessarily compatible with what is sort of a top-down planning of the new energy system would come up with in terms of behavior of these communities. And that is, of course, now being very much debated. How do we set pricing and tariff schemes and make it all dynamic so that the communities still have incentives to behave in line with the system goals. But in this project, we try to take a different perspective where we try to see the grid more as a constraint rather than as something to be optimized. So here we say, well, what if we let these communities do their own thing, be autonomous to some extent? What would happen to the overall system? And what are the sort of the fail-safes you need to put in place to prevent it from crashing, basically, but allowing for that diversity and that heterogeneity, and also allowing for the fact that different communities may have different preferences and different solutions. And again, here we see that the social network makes a big difference. So context plays a role, but we see that communities with similar contexts, they choose different solutions simply because of path dependence. And they're quite happy with these solutions and they get invested and they stick with it. So also there you see that, we need to find ways to accommodate this more diverse and heterogeneous future of these systems. And it's quite a challenge to build the models to analyze such a future. Okay, so to conclude, so how do we include these social processes in models and to enable analysis that look at technological change in the context of the societies that use these technologies? Well, first, it requires including bottom-up processes and their interactions. And these bottom-up models can then be used to feed the larger scale models like the IEMs, but at least they will be a little bit more evidence-based and have a bit of a range of likely behaviors underlying the large-scale models. They need to accommodate for heterogeneous actor behavior, and especially for the lower scale models where you really want to see what happens, this means that in many cases it will be about simulation and not optimization. And I think, these models can then really form the basis of more adaptive policy making, where policies try to hedge on to what is going on and try to reinforce and make certain behaviors stick rather than optimize towards a faraway policy goal and try to squeeze things in that direction even if the emergent behavior goes into another direction. And that more dynamic policy making is also, of course, a very big change. So that's my view on this. Thank you very much.
Many thanks. So many thanks for this really clear and intuitive lecture, and I think what we really have learned here, it's extremely important, I think, to really include agents, social behavior, human reactions, norms, values, because the best policy would not work if it's not accepted, and there's no one-size-fits-all policy, and I think we should really accept this more in our research. And we're a little bit short of time, so let me just allow 2 urgent questions from the audience who would like to have a comment. Is there any comment for Michael? Yeah, Michael?
Yes, thank you very much. Fascinating, and I mean, I fully agree. It's really important to understand the demand side processes as a driver, in fact, of technological changes and innovations, because they're completely underestimated if you just look at the forecasts based on sort of a static status of the demand side or linear development or whatever. In economic terms, this reminds me in a sense of a coordination problem we see in what are called network markets or platform markets. So the typical example are kind of like software platforms or communication platforms. So we have a number of providers, and they are willing to engage all the more the expected market size is, whereas we have a kind of a community of potential users who will be looking at what is actually being supplied to them and is there anything at all. And again, it depends on whether they expect that this particular kind of technology is picking up in the future. So they, both sides in a sense, face a switching problem. And you've talked a lot about the coordination on the demand side, which is clearly important. I was wondering, is your research also taking into account that there's actually a nexus with the supply side? Because what demand side networks are doing will depend what is happening on the supply side. I mean, your initial remarks were hinting at that, but I was wondering how much it inspires your research. Thanks.
Yes. So yes, we do. At the moment, that is, however, not super interesting because of the long investment times in the grid. Actually the easy solution seems to be to make household demand and the low voltage grid as standalone as possible, so that the high voltage grid, especially in the Netherlands, can be used to electrify industry and also from the North Sea to the industrial areas in Germany. So that is a sensible solution there to see, well, okay, how can we reduce interaction with the grid? And that is actually quite compatible with what many of the energy communities want. What is, of course, not so clear yet is how that indeed connects to overall sustainability goals. So what is the impact of these energy communities? Or is such a bottom-up process in the end just not going to deliver enough? That is another question. Yes.
Many thanks. I'm afraid we have to stop now, just to give enough time also for the other speakers. Thanks again, and I hope we have enough time during the coffee break to continue discussion. And let me introduce the next speaker, Sigrid Stagel. And I'm happy to introduce Sigrid, who is also corresponding member of the Austrian Academy of Sciences, and we have done a lot of collaborations, discussion together already. So she has a chair at the Institute for Ecological Economics and Competence Center for Sustainability, Transformation and Responsibility at the Vienna University of Economics. And let me really highlight, I think it's the first PhD you obtained, which was given to you in ecological economics. So you were the one really starting ecological economics through your PhD. And as this already tells us, your research is in ecological economics, in institutional economics and sustainability. And it's applied to various topics like energy and climate, food and agriculture. And let me also say, what we have heard in the last two talks is something also I think Sigrid is in a lot in this inequality argument. And you have also like a research institute of, in the Institute of Economics of Inequality and a master science program in socio-ecological economics and policy. It's extremely important, I think, to have this aspect of inequality, how to value our environment also in our curricula, just to learn it to the students. And you are board of, on several journals like, of course, ecological economics, but also environmental values, environmental policy and governance. And what is also, I think, amazing is the books you have written. I think one of the books is a standard book, Ecological Economics we're all using. It's an introduction for our students. And there's another book on the alternatives for environmental valuation, which is also wonderful. And I think we will learn more in this talk today, and looking forward.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Happy birthday to IIASA, and many thanks for the invitation. I'm an ecological economist, as Alexia has pointed out, and in ecological economics we perceive the economy as being embedded in society, and the two of them being based on the biophysical foundations. So we start with an ontology that requires actually an economic analysis always to be interdisciplinary, which may seem a bit counterintuitive, because if it's economics, how can it be interdisciplinary? But because we are still analyzing the housekeeping, but not just the housekeeping of humans, but also combine that, integrate it, just like a socio-ecological systems approach does, combine it with the housekeeping of nature. Yeah. So it's an attempt of an economist to really adopt a very clear systems approach for achieving a sustainable and just economy. Of course, we are reading materials such as The Planetary Boundaries, and the founding fathers of ecological economics, such as Herman Daly, who sadly recently passed away. He told at several occasions how he worked as the chief economist of the World Bank, and he got these diagrams of, well, what economists normally do, supply meets demand and so on, and he kept drawing a boundary around it. And every time people were reviewing it and he got it back, it had been erased. And he drew the box again. So it's really about introducing limits to the profession of economics. And of course, also Kenneth Boulding was a classic ecological economist, and well, this quote has become quite famous. I want to show that there are economists who are actually not mad persons and who are taking the finite planet very seriously. And I want to propose a way of how we could go about it. Andrew Oswald and Nicholas Stern, who are firmly within the mainstream of economics in October 2019, so about 3 years ago, wrote in the newsletter of the Royal Economic Society an article pointing out how little economists have contributed to the discussion about climate change. And they argue we are failing the world and our grandchildren. And we may be seen as on the wrong side of history. They reviewed the most cited journals in the field of economics, and many of them had never published articles on climate change. This is slowly changing. So the numbers that they have produced here are 3 years old. So it's slowly changing, but these are sort of the top-ranked journals in economics, and of the 77,000 articles that they've published since they've been established, roughly 40, 38 to be precise, were covering climate change. 38. More articles were dealing with basketball than climate change. So this is really disturbing. Of course, there are field journals, there are interdisciplinary journals where economists are contributing, but these are the highest ranking economics journals. And within mainstream economics, general economics, the environment, climate change, all the issues that we are talking about here are seen as sort of a special field, a specialization. Yeah? And I want to contest this, because as I said at the beginning, we are starting with the ontology that the economy is based on the biophysical foundations. So an economic analysis without accounting for the foundations is lacking something. Yeah? And we've also seen it a year before that, in 2018, when William Nordhaus, of course, received the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences, and his projections that he showed at during the presentation when he picked up the prize showed that the optimal path, according to his DICE model, which is a widely used integrated assessment model, the optimal path leads us to 4-degree increase of global temperature, which is probably contested within almost all people who have thought about sustainability and are versed in climate science. Yeah? It may be something that if we are doing some things horribly wrong, we may end up there, but to consider that as optimal, I would strongly contest that. This is just another projection that goes with it. More recently, Nicholas Stern has also highlighted that most economic models do not capture the nature and the extent of risks. They are not very good in capturing climate thresholds, tipping points, and so on. So there is an increasing awareness of the problem that standard economic models are just not up to the job. A recent review by Helmut Haberl and colleagues at the University of Life Sciences here in Vienna about the decoupling efforts and achievements has also pointed out that, well, decoupling of GDP per capita from various environmental pressure factors is, of course, the avenue that we're all hoping that we will be the path that we will be on, but we're just not there yet. Yeah, the absolute decoupling is just not something that we can observe systematically, as a recent systematic review has indicated. So probably we need a reframing of how we analyze economic systems. And I think Kate Raworth, with famously her approach is called donut economics, illustrates a way forward. So of course we have the planetary boundaries on the outer rim, and she combines it with the social foundations. At the time when she did that, she worked for Oxfam, so she used dimensions that were listed in policy documents. From a social science perspective, this is a bit frustrating because it doesn't work because it's not an analytical framework, but she didn't want to use an analytical framework. She wanted to borrow from the policy processes, democratic processes, and included social foundations in the center. We've tried to work with the same idea and also have the planetary boundaries on the outside, but just call whatever is in the center, what we are aiming for, human flourishing. And we can conceptualize that as either social well-being, subjective well-being, or the happiness research that is going on and is quite prolific. Or we could conceptualize it as human needs, or of course we could conceptualize it as capabilities. Yeah? Amartya Sen's capability approach. So these are social science ways of analyzing and bringing human flourishing to the center of economic analysis, but still bring it in line with the biophysical boundaries. And of course, there is the safe and just space for humanity, which is where societies negotiate, where institutions are being designed. We have different institutional architectures. And of course, whatever scientists tell us is not just given to society and taken for granted, but there are governance processes, there are interpretations of uncertainties, and decisions that are being made on limits. And when we are looking at a proxy to this approach, which former colleagues of mine from the University of Leeds have done, and tried to see by use of international data, are there any countries that are actually achieving the social goals, the social foundations, or meeting human needs, and at the same time stay within biophysical limits. And they've used these indicators as the proxies for human needs: life satisfaction, healthy life expectancy, nutrition, sanitation, income, access to energy, education, social support, democratic quality, equality, and employment. Again, it's not quite an analytical, coherent framework from social science, but this is where data are available, and it's not wrong. Yeah. So there's one country where, on the positive side, they are not trespassing any biophysical limits, but in the center, the human needs, or as they are defined here, through these dimensions, are not met. Yeah. Red means not met, blue means achieved. Yeah. So this is a poor country, it's Bangladesh. It's probably not the model that we can copy because, well, human needs aren't met for the population, although on the biophysical side, they are actually successful. Here is another country. Human needs satisfaction is happening more here, although there are still some failings, but already at that level, biophysical boundaries are being transpassed. This is Albania, which we would still consider as a poor country. And here we have another country, human needs are being met, at least on average, not for every single person, but the means are available to do it. But systematically, biophysical limits are trespassed. And this is Austria. You could take Germany, you could take France, it will show the same picture. Yeah. So the problem is no country meets the needs of the population and stays within biophysical limits. This is the same story as probably a more familiar graph indicates here. On the x-axis we have the Human Development Index, which of course consists of income, education, and life expectancy. So we want countries, each dot is a country, we want countries to move towards the right, so to have a higher human development. But on the y-axis, we have the number of Earths. If their ways of living and producing was generalized, the number of Earths that would be required, we have some here with 9 or 8 Earths that would be required. So we need to push the countries that are above the 1 down, so that all countries are actually ending up in the global sustainable development quadrant. But we see most countries are not within that quadrant, so there's still a lot of work to be done. So what can economists contribute? I would argue that a utility-based, product-focused, technology-obsessed way of doing analysis is not up to the job. Instead, in ecological economics, we consider economics as the science of social provisioning. The social highlights the interdependence and cooperation of people in daily and intergenerational livelihoods and reflects the view of the economy as embedded in society. So we have components of acting persons and organizations, their capacity to act, social structures and relationships, and social institutions. So these are our elements of what we are analyzing. Economic activities that generate income depend on unpaid activities at the household and community level and on environmental goods and services. So the provisioning systems can be combined with human needs frameworks, such as Manfred Max-Neef has suggested or Ian Goch has suggested, and we can identify different provisioning systems that deliver the provisioning factors, namely satisfiers, that are required to satisfy human needs. The satisfiers are the delivery systems as sets of interrelated elements that work together in transforming resources to meet a foreseen human need. So we have the provisioning system that consists of human needs and satisfiers and the institutions that are involved in it. And they are mediators between the biophysical resource use and human well-being. The human needs are finite, they are few, they are classifiable, and basic human needs are the same in all cultures and in all historical epochs. Manfred Max-Neef lists these human needs, for example, and Doyle and Goch have a different list. It doesn't matter which list one prefers, but we can name them. They are finite and they are satiable. Yeah? The satisfiers, however, they are not the same in all cultures. They vary. The ways how we are satisfying the human needs, but we can distinguish between satisfiers that are contributing to a climate-friendly society and satisfiers that are very resource-intense, for example. Yeah? So there is a way of discriminating between different ways of satisfying human needs. And we can marry this with another idea, namely the universal basic services, not universal basic income, but universal basic services, meaning providing basic services to all, which takes out uncertainty from these increasingly complex systems that we live in. So universal basic service is not a new idea. It is based on the spirit of US President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. And we have it already built into European social welfare states. We are well aware of social areas of public services such as water supply, education, housing, transportation, healthcare and childcare, where we do not apply market mechanisms, but either we provide them for free, such as in education in Austria, or we provide them in a regulated way, such as social housing or cooperative housing. This could be extended to care for elderly, for example. It can also be extended to energy. So we had a lot of discussions about how to deal with increasing energy prices in the current situation. I think to apply a universal basic service spirit to it would be helpful. And what's important is always satisfying human needs for all. So a climate-friendly society requires a more comprehensive transformation of the economic system that prioritizes the satisfaction of human needs with low energy input and to organize supply. So key pillars of the required changes in supply run counter to the prevailing political economic regime. And we need to address the obstacles to sustainable needs satisfaction. And I think universal basic services is an element of a policy mix that might be productive in this context. Just as a last slide here, this is from Ian Goch's book on heat, greed, and human need. He has actually, he's an economist who has worked most of his career in social policy, but most recently has tried to marry that with the climate concerns. And what he argues is that at the moment we are in pillar C1. This is ramp up eco-efficiency. This is ecological modernization, green growth. Yeah. And I've been part of a team of researchers here in Austria who have sort of developed a handbook for policymakers for developing the national energy and climate plan because the first version that the Austrian government submitted, we were just not satisfied with, to be honest, because we thought, well, in the literature, there are many, many measures that have been tried and evaluated, and we were trying to offer sort of a menu from which they can choose. But these plans, and therefore also this handbook, is very firmly within the C1 column, which is ecological modernization. The main aim is to improve technology, let markets work. And we may get towards more sustainability. My expectation is, however, that that ain't enough. And therefore, I think we need a plan of how to take next steps. And Ian Goch suggests avenues of how to go further, like recompose consumption and post-growth reduce consumption. These may be steps that we need to take if we cannot achieve the reduction in climate emissions that we need. Thank you very much for your attention.
And there's one hand up, very quick question, very quick answer, and then we have to immediately move to the last two speakers.
Yeah, thank you. Klaus Kubetschko from AIT. So thank you for your speech. I mean, you know that I fully agree with what you're saying. Only one thing, you mentioned energy. Energy in the European Union is a service of public interest. It is already in the law. The only thing is that in the current regime, we are thinking that the market mechanisms have to deal with this topic. This is the only thing, but it is, legally it is already what you mentioned. Thank you.
Maybe a very quick answer because we have time pressure.
This was a very deliberate decision that was made when the liberalization of energy markets was decided. A similar avenue might have been chosen with water. Luckily, that was diverted because of a lot of protests around Europe. So we need different institutions, absolutely. Yeah.
Many thanks, and I really hope that we have enough time during the coffee break to continue our discussion. Let me now introduce our next speaker, Aaron Ackerwell, and it's my pleasure, really, in a sense, like to really shortly tell about the background. So he's Samuel. I can put this away. He's Samuel Tresk, Dana Professor of Governance and Sustainability at the School for Environmental and Sustainability at the University of Michigan. And he holds several more positions at the University of Michigan. He's affiliated to the faculty at the Gerald Ford School of Public Policy, and he's also affiliated to the Center for Political Studies at the University of Michigan. being brought now to say like the research and teaching is basically based in politics of international development, institutional change, conservation, and of course sustainability. And most important, I think he has applied his research to more than 20 countries in the tropical world. So I'm sure we will see more about this in a minute. And he has recently been also in 2018 elected to the National Academy of Sciences. He is in many boards, in many committees, many books, and I will stop here to have enough time and just mention the title of the talk has slightly changed. It will be on the vision of the commons in a polarized world. There will be no slides, and we are all looking forward, and thanks for coming to Vienna.
Thank you very much, Alexia. It's a great pleasure to be here. I want to thank you for the invitation to speak at this really important moment in the history and future of IIASA, the celebration of its 50th anniversary. I'm grateful to be included in the event and humbled by the Institute's accomplishments and mandate. But I'm also inspired. I'm inspired by your history, by the lofty ambitions of your founders, by your current leaders, by what you've achieved. And of course, its goals for the future are the most important cause for inspiration. But to be sure that what I say as a result of this inspiration is grounded, and at least grounded in a little bit in what I know about, I want to focus my comments on the research on the commons. One can think of the commons, arrangements to use resources and capacities collectively, as systems. Indeed, it is this feature of commons as small-scale systems that has helped this research program to thrive. Studies of thousands of commons arrangements throughout the world, some small, some larger, have led to a robust body of work that identifies what the commons do, where they exist, and how they can be managed better. One would not be wrong to claim that the scholarship on the commons is one of the more successful research programs in the social and ecological sciences. It's the only program, for example, whose leading scholar received a Nobel Prize. This research, since inception, has focused on the alternatives to state and market-based governance of renewable resources. By focusing on the specifics of institutional arrangements, it has made three critical enduring contributions. It has, one, identified thousands of examples of commons, distinguished them from markets and states. It has documented how the governance of resources through self-organized collective institutions can substitute for other arrangements. And it has shown that commons are not a historical curiosity. They are the concrete expression of a third way, critical venues for supporting the consolidation of civil society and durable examples of co-management and decentralized governance of resources. More than 80 countries pursue decentralized governance in part as a result of the research on the commons and its demonstration that local communities, small groups of people can manage their resources. They don't have to be managed by the state. The empirical focus on a specific class of collective action problems, those related to social ecological systems, has generated a common framework for analysis. And through this framework, scholars of commons have strengthened theories of human choices and collective action. They have improved available knowledge about diverse outcomes in social ecological systems, and they have developed and applied novel methods to deepen investigations of social and environmental patterns. These insights are relevant for exciting pathways towards new discoveries in other fields. So what's the criticism? The promise of the commons is to imagine a different future. It's also the dominant need of our time, as we heard in your talk. Predating common scholarship, communities grounded in solidarity relationships among members were a source of inspiration to foundational thinkers of the social sciences as the 19th century gave way to the 20th. In the first quarter of the 21st century, commons and community are no less a hope for a different future, for a different set of possibilities.
The Commons started as research into alternative institutional arrangements, alternatives to markets and states. Much of the work on the Commons, however, has been about the arrangements, not about the alternative. Research on the Commons should focus, aims to focus on an alternative that is about optimism. This alternative of the Commons draws attention away from polarized narratives around accelerating biophysical threats that characterize the contemporary politics of the Anthropocene. This optimism is anchored in findings that elaborating the possibilities, contributions, and limitations of such an alternative, rather than identifying ever more precisely the details of arrangements that produce sustainable resource commons, is crucial if commons scholarship is to continue contributing meaningfully to intellectual and policy outcomes. Focusing on present challenges and advancing future scholarship on the commons as an alternative is also critical to realizing a just and sustainable Anthropocene. From the 1980s, scholarship on the commons began to shift towards a conceptual framework that generated systematic comparisons of empirical regularities. This framework found its most influential expression in Elinor Ostrom's Governing the Commons. She identified a small set of 9 institutional principles conducive to long-term persistence of institutions related to small-scale renewable resources. Ostrom drew inspiration from other domains of scholarship. And some of these were focused, for example, on competitive free markets. Free markets require numerous buyers and sellers, entry and exit without barriers, homogeneous goods and services, and perfect information. The Weberian bureaucratic ideal type is defined by hierarchical coordination and control, role specialization, professional management, rule-based decision-making, and expectations of permanence and continuity. Kenneth Harris showed that no social choice mechanism could simultaneously meet basic conditions of rationality and democratic decision-making. Analogously, Ostrom identified a very small set of design principles for successful governance of commons: clear boundaries for resources and users, congruence between rules and resource systems, rule-making autonomy, accountable community monitoring, graduated sanctions, mechanisms for adjudication, recognition by higher authorities, and nested institutions. But almost immediately after she published her work, which led to her winning the Nobel Prize, the Reichsbank Prize in Economic Sciences in the memory of Alfred Nobel, almost immediately other scholars began to add new principles, new conditions for successful commons, especially emphasizing politics, culture, justice, and the structuring role of context. In response, Ostrom developed the social ecological systems framework, drawing upon related scholarship and incorporating a large number of nearly 200 new relevant features that matter to the effective governance and functioning of social ecological systems. The objective of identifying a parsimonious set of design principles thus came to an end. It was born in 1990, it died in 2000. But scholars of commons nonetheless continue to assess the relevance and importance of specific design features and contextual conditions. Abandoning the search for parsimony on the one hand has allowed the research program to continue identifying new contextual features, new user characteristics, resources, system attributes, and institutional arrangements that support successful collective action and enable positive commons outcomes. On the other hand, it has become difficult to accumulate knowledge across different research efforts because of differences in their contexts, cases, definitions, variables, and so forth. Future progress for the field hinges on the members being able to respond to the challenges and opportunities of the Anthropocene and address persistent gaps characteristic of current and past research in the field. Unprecedented threats to human societies and natural systems are evident both globally and locally in the forms of climate change, ecosystem erosion, social polarization, and striking injustices and inequalities. These threats are emergent against a background of accelerating global change in the organization and dynamics of social relationships, in institutional evolution, in technological innovation, and in ecological system change. A consequence of these shifts is greater unpredictability in social actions. A second evident result is the extraordinary growth in inequality and in the polarization of politics, in the concentration of wealth and power. These momentous shifts and threats demand responses commensurate to their magnitude. Scholarship on the commons is well placed for such responses because of the very focus of its work, the commons. The social and institutional emblem that the commons pose and the process and pathways towards it stand in contrast to the dominant formations of markets and states. The commons promise a different approach and shape for social relationships and interactions. One example of such a response, commoning, is already in evidence. The rapidly growing literature on commoning charts a different path than that of identifying conditions that would facilitate collective action and positive outcomes on the commons. Instead, it treats commoning as a result to redefine political relationships that underpin social, economic, and socio-environmental engagements. With a focus on practice, contingency, and community, those involved in commoning see themselves engaged in the creation of collective pathways of surviving that run counter to the dominant forms of our time, of our society. The challenge, as one of the leaders in that field puts it, is to build a radically different system while living in an incumbent system that aggressively resists transformational change. It's not just the articulation of attractive alternatives, but identifying credible strategies and pathways for actualizing them that is the task at hand. Examples of commoning are visible across diverse contexts, not just in the context of social ecological systems. In the form of buying clubs, stakeholder trusts sponsored by governments, open source programming, peer production and design networks, artisan guilds, labor sharing arrangements, the list goes on. For many of these examples, social movement, protests, technological innovation, and novel institutional arrangements are critical constitutive elements. The inspiration for contemporary commoning lies both in the classical works of Karl Polanyi and Ivan Illich, but also the more recent writings of David Graeber and Elinor Ostrom. Commoning, I suggest, is a novel underpinning for the extension of commons ideals and principles to new social and institutional domains. It's a reaction to the volatility and unpredictability of polarization, uncertainty, and concentration of wealth and power. It's most directly a reaction to the diverse forms of enclosure and commodification that capitalism and globalization have come to stand for. It comprises elements that are fundamental to the very meaning of being human. A shift in the orientation of scholarship on the commons is overdue. Such a shift is simultaneously a call for commons systems to move away from identifying more precisely the features of institutions and context for positive social ecological outcomes. And shifting, such a focus has perhaps sidelined the investigation of revolutionary possibilities that the idea of the commons embodies. In a period when the repressive power of the state and the hegemonic power of the markets continues to grow, it's all the more important for scholars of commons and for systems more generally to study the radical power and possibilities that the commons present for the Anthropocene. It will require an examination of the overlap between research on the commons and that on degrowth, decolonization, social movements, environmental justice, and political ecology. It will help identify how the commons advance a progressive politics that imagines and seeks a better future than the one promised by the embattled market democracies of today. The field of the commons rightly celebrates the Nobel Prize of Elinor Ostrom. At the same time, the most appealing celebration of this success would be to grasp and elaborate the possibilities that the commons hold for the current moment and for the future generations of the Anthropocene. Doing so will require more focused, more inclusive, more integrated scholarship that grapples with threats from both markets and states to democratic participation, to reciprocity-based exchanges, and the fundamental dignity and equality of human relationships. It will require imagining and elaborating relationships for a social order in which a select few do not monopolize the vast majority of global resources. And most of all, it will require partnerships that focus on how to achieve and secure such engagement, reciprocity, and equity. Such a prize will truly be uncommon. It will also be the most rewarding of all for stakeholders in the commons. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this wonderful insight into this property of the commons and this problem of the commons.
I think more importantly, also saved you 2 minutes, didn't I?
Yeah. And let me also ask now the audience. I think we have time. We don't have time, but we should have, I think, now 1 or 2 urgent questions. Now I scared everyone because of the time. I can already tell you we will prolong the coffee break to 11:45. So you don't miss a coffee, you can still ask a question. It doesn't help at the moment, no? Okay. Yeah, Michael.
Yeah, thank you very much, and apologies, I feel like monopolizing a bit. Anyway, thanks very much for this very nice kind of overview on the history also of the research into the commons and outlook into the future. One thing that struck me while you're talking, and maybe you've mentioned it somewhere, when thinking about commons problems, and actually the very English word for it is already very nicely ambivalent because it's like a singular plural construct. And I was wondering, in the research, to what extent is it actually acknowledged that presumably we're dealing with many layers of commons and overlapping commons problems? Because, sorry to get back to the design of institutions, but presumably that should be something which is really important, that actors are not just part to one commons problem, but many. And I was just wondering, it's a question out of ignorance because I've never came across this, but is there any thinking about this?
Yeah, there's a fair amount of work that looks at how individual arrangements, individual common systems can work together, and the answers are relatively easy. I shouldn't say easy. The answers are relatively straightforward. One is through federated or federal structures that can allow individual commons to come together to work on larger problems or problems at a larger scale. A second response comes from a more utopian vision of commons, where the idea is that as some commons demonstrate success, or some arrangements demonstrate success, other locations may also pick on that. And such a rhizomatic approach to the success of the commons is not entirely utopian, because our tendency is typically to compare what exists with what might be. And what exists didn't really come fully formed out of the head of Zeus. It came into being as a result of the market economies of today. The globalized world order came into being as a result of literally hundreds of years of individual actions of millions of people. So to compare the possibilities of what could be because it doesn't exist with the reality of what is because it exists is, in some senses, to doom yourself to a presentist and to an existential bias in our own thinking, which is that because what exists, that's the only thing that could exist. And that's really, I think, the illusion of realism from which the promise of commons asks us to get away. Yeah.
Many thanks. I have seen another hand up, but I'm afraid now we really have to stop. And I'm sure during the coffee break we have the chance to ask more questions. And Indeed, I would also have a question for the coffee break about the second tragedy of the commons, like reviewed by Ron Lee and others, which we could maybe discuss also during the coffee break. So let me come now to the last speaker of this plenary session, to Jim Hole, and maybe best known to all of us here really as the chair of the Scientific Advisory Committee of IIASA. But for many of us, we also, of course, know you from the literature. He's a professor of climate and environmental risks in the University of Oxford and also director of research in the School of Geography and the Environment. I'm not going in all your academic positions, but I'm just focusing really on the topics, and I think they're extremely important. It's the research on risk analysis and decision making under uncertainty, especially applied to water resource systems, flood, coastal risks, etc. And it's really this risk analysis we need to really bring into the climate topic, I think, because it's extreme, these climate extremes, I mean, coming more often to a higher extent, and I think this risk will increase in the future. And it's the implication for our infrastructures and for our economic systems. And it's impressive, I think, I mean, what you have done in your research, but I really want to highlight, it's really the first national water resource system simulation that has been done by you and your group, and it's applied now in many countries all over the world. And I think for your work you have got numerous awards. You're a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering, you're editor of the Water Resource Research Journal. I could continue, but I leave the time for your talk. Looking forward for your talk.
Thank you and good morning. I must begin by saying what a joy and an honor it is to be here at the IIASA conference. As others have said before me, the world needs the IIASA more now than ever. The world faces systemic challenges on an unprecedented scale, which requires system solutions. And an organization like IIASA that can reach across national boundaries whilst drawing upon the insights, the deep insights of scientists and policymakers within national member organizations. The topic I've been given to talk about today could hardly have been more ambitious. Decision making under uncertainty, under disruptive shocks, uncertainty and complexity. I've got some doubts as to whether I'll be able to do justice to all of that, but I'll do my best. Decision makers have always faced uncertainty, but two features that define our current era are the apparent frequency of disruptive shocks and the capacity of these shocks to propagate in a globalized world via more or less complex interactions. The litany of shocks that we've encountered this century are all too familiar. The 9/11 terrorist attacks in 2001, the global financial crisis of 2008, which coincided with a global food price shock, followed by the Arab Spring in 2010, the Syrian civil war, a migrant crisis of Syrians, then Rohingyas, and many other displaced peoples. Then in December 2019, a novel virus was identified in the city of Wuhan, and the rest of the story we all know all too well. And though the pandemic is receding, some of the long-term impacts on supply chains and labor scarcity seem to have become baked in. And as world leaders were still talking about building back better, and whilst supply-side constraints were driving up inflation, the Russian invasion of Ukraine precipitated a global energy and food crisis, and other fiscal crises are on their way. So what next? Well, unlikely a period of stability in which the future arches ahead of us in a series of smooth curves, lines, like the scenarios of an integrated assessment model. We're becoming used to a world being characterized by a series of shocks. What have we learned from these recent experiences? Here's a few observations. First, behavior is much more mutable than many of us has anticipated. People are apparently willing to change their behavior, even in vocal Western democracies, where the possibility of radical behavioral change was mostly dismissed in despairing terms. Yet we've observed quite dramatic changes during the pandemic and now during the energy crisis. Secondly, path dependency matters and some behaviors stick. We're in a hybrid meeting in which many people are benefiting around the world without the cost, inconvenience, and environmental impact of travel. Central banks have learned how to throw vast sums of money at the economy in the global financial crisis and resorted to the same tactics during the pandemic. Which leads to a third observation, which is about changing expectations of the role of government, which is expected by people to be much more interventionist than the preceding orthodoxy of the Washington Consensus has implied. That's also linked to the rise of populism, which appeals to a nostalgic paternalism, whilst at the same time seeking to subvert the institutions of the modern state. So how should decision makers respond to this world of shocks? Another thing that we've learned from the pandemic is that unprecedented things can be done by small, very focused groups of people with a mandate to solve problems. But they can't keep on doing that. For example, the Vaccines Task Force in the UK arranged the regulatory approval, manufacture and rollout of a vaccine on timescales that literally had not previously been believed feasible. And similarly, remarkable feats were achieved in other countries on unprecedented timescales. People achieve things to deal with the crisis that would not previously have been believed possible. But it's unrealistic to think that people can follow a sprint with another sprint. A more resilient system is needed to bolster agile teams that are prepared for the next sprint in the next crisis, whatever it may be. Meanwhile, and of course this is a cliche, decision makers mustn't lose sight of the long term. That's a lot to ask of governments at the moment as they stagger from one crisis to the next. So part of the solution needs to be increasingly institutionalizing stability. Independent central banks are supposed to be part of the institutional architecture of stability, but that doesn't look like it at the moment as they tussle with inflation while governments fret about stimulating growth. The example of institutionalizing stability that I most often give is the UK's Climate Change Act, which was passed with all-party support in 2008. In the meantime, we've had periods of climate skepticism in Britain, as many countries have, but a piece of legislation, including an independent body, the Committee on Climate Change, which scrutinizes the government's targets and progress towards net zero and reports to Parliament, has meant that we've been able to ride out the occasional political storm. Several countries have experimented and some have institutionalized commissions for future generations with a mandate to look for the long term. In Britain, I sit on the National Infrastructure Commission, which has a mandate to advise on the country's long-term infrastructure needs and avoid the politicization of infrastructure. I have to say that the Commission's attempts to avoid political games of football with infrastructure, like railways and nuclear power plants, has only been partially successful. Yet at least the principle is widely accepted, that instability and erratic decisions have a disproportionately deleterious effect upon achieving our long-term goals. How can systems analysis help all of this? In any one of the shocks that I've mentioned, one might think about a system, like a financial system, the food system, the energy system, which is subject to exogenous shocks, like financial crises or multiple breadbasket failures. System simulation provides us with the capacity to stress test the system in silico in a very wide range of conditions and gain insights into system response. Two recent examples from research within my group in Oxford have demonstrated how system simulation has enabled identifications of hotspots of vulnerability and prioritization of potential solutions. In the freight transport network in East Africa, we've constructed a geospatial trade model that enables prioritization of interventions to minimize the impacts of extreme weather events on trade flows and the economy. Also in Africa, we've demonstrated the vulnerability of riparians on the Blue Nile to prolonged droughts, and hence designed risk-based water release strategies, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, that will minimize downstream impacts at the end of a long drought when it occurs, as it inevitably will. In our current modeling of the resilience of the global food trade as part of the Oxford Martin Programme on Systemic Resilience, we're examining the relative benefits for food importing countries to diversify their number of food trade partners, strengthen the quality of trading relationships, promote domestic agricultural production, and or invest in food commodity storage. And there's a series of trade-offs associated with those 4 different food system resilience interventions. However, when we think about this century's shocks, we recognize they're cascading from one domain to the next and how they can amplify through those interdependencies. The food and energy price shocks currently underway are reverberating into fiscal crises because countries' balance sheets were already loaded up with debts incurred during the pandemic. So our systems analysis needs to represent the interacting set of domains: food, energy, health, mobility, finance, political, armed conflict. Models of these systems should provide a shared space for decision makers to congregate around and work through scenario exercises to test response capabilities. Which brings me to the final aspect of this talk's title, uncertainty. Early in my career, I worked as an engineer. I worked on structural reliability, the theory which was one of the many creations of John von Neumann. My professor at the time, David Blockley, had pointed out that actual structural disasters, bridge collapses, for example, happen 1 or 2 orders of magnitude more frequently on average than was implied by the probability of failure in structural reliability calculations. That worried us. A probability of failure is a rather precise statement about the relative likelihood or belief, depending on whether you're a frequentist or a Bayesian, about the future, which empirical evidence clearly demonstrated was wrong, not just a bit wrong, but orders of magnitude wrong. Actually, there's a rich literature of why structural failures occur in practice, and they're rarely the consequence of an unusually weak structural member encountering an unusually large load, which is what structural reliability theory quantifies. It's much more to do with oversights, errors, misunderstandings in the design, construction, and maintenance of structures. Often this stems from systemic deficiencies in what has become known as organizational safety culture. David Blockley had explored how these more qualitative uncertainties could be encoded within fuzzy set theory. And in my PhD, I examined how fuzzy sets and probabilities, which I must confirm are the right mathematical tool for encoding natural variability and aleatory uncertainties, could be generalized in the framework of random set theory, and that took me in turn to an even more inclusive generalization of imprecise probability theory. That's a beautiful theory that encodes ambiguous and probabilistic information within a coherent behavioral interpretation of lower and upper betting rates. And then when I was in my first faculty position in collaboration with Elmer Kriegler at Pick, John Schollenhuber challenged us to do something useful with imprecise probabilities. and explore how they could be applied to the uncertainties surrounding tipping points in the Earth system. We went through a painstaking expert elicitation exercise to obtain imprecise probability estimates of the conditional probability of tipping points conditional upon a specified global mean temperature pathway from more than 50 world-leading scientists. It was the first, and I'm pleased to say the last, expert elicitation exercise I've done in my career. And though it led to two of my most highly cited papers, it exposed for me some practical challenges to the usefulness of imprecise probability theory. First, the results are very sensitive to the method you choose to aggregate expert opinions. Secondly, there are very difficult theoretical problems with the generalization of Bayesian conditioning to imprecise probabilities. And third, in practice, the results become very sensitive to the experts' assertions about the bounds on their probability statements. That worried me a lot, because speaking to experts, you find that they have well-formed beliefs about central tendencies, the most likely thing that's going to happen, which in a moment I'll refer to as a reference narrative. But experts understandably find it very difficult to specify the bounds on their uncertainty. The infogap theory proposed by Jacob Benheim, who I'm still collaborating with, provides a nice solution to that problem. In the infogap starts with the best estimate of what the future holds and then conducts a comprehensive sensitivity analysis over an ever-increasing horizon of uncertainty, resulting in a graph of how robust a solution is to increasing uncertainty. I also like infogap theory because it focuses on preference orderings amongst options and the robustness of those preference orderings to uncertainty, which is basically the fundamental question of decision-making under uncertainty. But so far, I've never done an infogap analysis that a decision maker has paid much attention to. I think for decision-making under uncertainty to be accessible, we actually need to revert to much more simple methods, which brings me back to the reference narrative. Mervyn King, who was governor of the Bank of England during the global financial crisis, and John Kay, who was dean of Oxford's Side Business School, published a book a couple of years ago called Radical Uncertainty. The title infuriated me because I wondered why one needed a new name for something Frank Knight wrote about in 1921, and since then has been given perfectly satisfactory names like deep uncertainty and severe uncertainty. Nonetheless, King and Kay provided a lot of illuminating examples, especially from finance and economics, as to how unexpected things have happened and apparently surprised decision makers. Their advice is to think about the future in terms of a reference narrative and then stress test it by systematically challenging the assumptions in the reference narrative and examining how it could be thrown off track in different shocks. In the end, we're talking about a systematic sensitivity analysis examining the impacts that uncertainties may have on preference orderings. And that's ultimately what imprecise probabilities, infogap, robust decision-making are all doing. It doesn't sound that glamorous, though there's plenty of theoretical subtlety in sensitivity analysis, but in my experience, in the end, it's what decision makers pay attention to. The other concept, which in my experience is intuitively appealing to decision makers, is dynamic adaptive pathways. That's the notion that one should be thinking sequentially into the future about a set of decision points and the future circumstances that then may require changes of course. We began working on that concept 20 years ago in the Thames Estuary 2100 adaptation plan, and since then dynamic adaptive pathways have become embedded in the IPCC Working Group 2, thinking about adaptation both in the 5th and the 6th assessment reports. I think decision makers intuitively get the idea of a decision tree spreading out into the future with critical decision points contingent upon the external circumstances at play at that juncture. Concepts of the reference narrative and dynamic adaptive pathways challenge decision makers to think about the contingencies that need to be in place to cope with a range of different eventualities, and to think about multi-purpose resilience mechanisms, capacity building, particularly in human and institutional capacity, but also financial capacity, trusted relationships in supply chains with neighbors and allies, yield benefits when confronted with a very wide range of different shocks. And all of that contributes to multi-purpose resilience. We're expecting a great deal from decision makers, the wisdom to look to the long term and the agility to anticipate and respond to the unexpected when disruptive shocks continue to arrive with alarming frequency. They're bombarded with data, not to mention tweets, and tech gurus would have decision makers immersing themselves in real-time data feeds. As far as I'm concerned, that's wrong. Decision making under disruptive shocks, uncertainty and complexity is firmly in Danny Kahneman's slow thinking category. It takes deliberative thinking with wise advice from a diversity of sources to challenge assumptions and devise practical and adaptive responses. Systems analysis contributes to this task in the formulation of system models of appropriate levels of complexity, in the testing of the response to those systems to a wide range of external shocks, and in the appraisal of solutions which can target sensitive intervention points. That's not to say that if we'd had decision makers who were all systems thinkers, we would not have suffered the consequences of the shocks that we've incurred over the last 2 decades. Who knows? But what has happened has fundamentally challenged previous assumptions about security, financial stability, political systems, and public health. And if we're to navigate this uncertain future, we need systems thinking now more than ever. Thank you.
Many thanks for this fascinating insight, and I think you have given us a lot of advice what has to be done, but a lot of open questions remain how we are going to do this. And let me open, I think, the floor for discussion for 1 or 2 questions before we move to the coffee break. Is there anyone? Everyone is looking forward to the coffee already. No, here we have Elena.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Jim, for indeed very informative talk with a lot of new ideas that we can borrow from that. I want to ask a question that I'm asked very often when I talk about decisions and uncertainty, and that is, how do we communicate uncertainty to the general public, to decision makers, to whoever we want to communicate it? There are 2 views here. So one is that this is confusing, and this can actually undermine trust in what we are communicating, right? Because we are telling them that actually it's so uncertain. Or the other view is that we should communicate uncertainty and should be clear about that, because that actually should inspire trust to what we are talking about. So I wonder what your thoughts about this is.
Certainly we should be endeavoring to communicate uncertainties. Not to do that is dishonest. I think a lot was learned about that in the pandemic, in fact, in terms of the communication of scientific uncertainties. I find, however, that notions of multiple scenarios just quickly baffle people, and that's why, and I would re-emphasize that in response to your question, Elena, we should be able to talk about some version of the future and then go on to the ways in which the future might differ from that version, as opposed to baffling with people with the notion that there are many different multiverses out there which they need to get their heads around.
Many thanks. Maybe there's one more question here, and then we should maybe end the...
Okay, is it on? Yeah, okay, thanks. Thanks very much, Jim, for really giving, as Elena said, a lot of new ways of thinking about the things we've been thinking about for quite some time at IIASA, so it's really appreciated. I'm sorry that Helga Novotny couldn't have been here yesterday, because she taught me something once about uncertainty, that, as you know, of course, being at IIASA, we were thinking of all the Bayesian and all the ways we could mathematize uncertainty. And what she told me, and which is something I have experienced a lot since then, is that policymakers don't want to hear anything about uncertainty. And then I actually published a paper called The Political Processing of Uncertainty years ago. And I'm just wondering, that was years ago, I'm wondering what has been your experience. I know, talking to consultants who provide reports to governments, often say, we put the uncertainty all in a footnote. Because they can't go out and justify their decisions if they say, oh, there's just an absolutely huge amount of uncertainty around this. So yeah, I wonder what has been your experience actually working with policymakers and how much uncertainty they actually want to stomach.
The first thing I would say is that policymakers are a very big category which contains many different kind of types of actor. And so if we're talking about high-level politicians, then they're really often in soundbite territory, and that does exclude possibilities for deliberating much about the nature of uncertainty. But there are many other policy situations, fortunately, in which there are more opportunities for deliberation. Having said that, and I mean, I think I was trying to make this very clear in my talk, is that my experience that the types of methodologies and mathematizations which you and I have enjoyed quite a lot over the years don't in their don't start with that. And as I was my kind of thesis this morning was that there are two tools which do seem to get traction in that context. One, the notion that your best beliefs about the future may well be get thrown off course, and so think about the circumstances in which they do get thrown off course. And secondly, and I think I'm quite positive about this actually, that many, again, not necessarily politicians, but more specialist decision makers actually find it quite easy to talk about the notion of adaptive pathways, even if they don't kind of fully get the methodology for doing it technically. The notion that they're presenting a policy, they're recognizing that there are uncertainties, they're considering the need to review that at some point in the future because they're expecting that circumstances will change. I think that's highly intuitive. And in fact, it's not surprising because, I mean, many things from in many parts of the world have institutionalized decision-making cycles. I mean, this started with 5-year plans, didn't it? And I mean, also, if we look at the Climate Change Act that I referred to in my talk, that has a 5-year review cycle, and NDCs have a review cycle as well. So all of this kind of institutionalizes the notion that we're going to have to come back and look at this decision again because the future's uncertain.
Many things. I'm afraid I get warnings already. I think we have now to finish. There's no uncertainty about the end time of the coffee break. And this is 11:45 o'clock. Let me thank all the speakers again. It's a fascinating session, and I hope we take this day and continue discussing further. Many thanks to all of you.